Hunter S. Thompson is often misremembered as a wisecracking, drug-addled cartoon character. But in the new book, Freak Kingdom, Hunter S. Thompson's manic 10-year crusade against American fascism, tonight's speaker reclaims Thompson for what he truly was, a fearless opponent of corruption and fascism who sacrificed his future well-being to fight against it and rewrote the rules of journalism and political satire in the process. I just got the book 2 days ago, so I haven't had time to finish it yet. I'm up to where I think they're going to the Nixon campaign. It's really, really well-written history. He demonstrates a high level of expertise. He's clearly done an enormous amount of research and reflection on Thompson and his career. I'm looking forward to hearing more. Please join me in welcoming George Mason University professor and Hunter S. Thompson scholar, Timothy Denevi.
Thank you for the lovely intro. Hi, everyone. How are we doing? You know, strikes and gutters, ups and downs. It's pretty good. I'm so happy to be in Louisville tonight. And I would really just like to thank the Library Foundation and the library and Chandra Gordon. And if I had a bet to make tonight on any specific game, it would be a donation to the library. And that's what all of us should be doing. And we should all text, as she said, because whatever democracy is, it doesn't work without this place that we're all at right now. I'm going to read some short stuff tonight, and then we'll talk. You know, it'll be pretty quick, and it's about 9 pages, and it's about the 1968 Democratic National Convention, and then it's about Nixon's inauguration in 1969, both of which Hunter S. Thompson attended. I'd like to thank Hunter S. Thompson's family and friends for writing beautiful books and being wonderful people and having us all out right now. That's a marketing thing to say, we don't know the real Hunter Thompson. I think that people that knew Hunter Thompson, I never had the chance to meet him, they knew from the start his brilliance, and they understood what he saw in America and what was important. And I'm just so lucky, as someone who never had a chance to meet him, to be able to interact with Juan Thompson and to be able to interact with Ron Whitehead. And it's a wonderful thing. And I'm very thankful for it. And you know, y'all should go to Gonzo Fest. Like, for real, like, it's gonna be great. Like, it's gonna be great. Let's do a Gonzo Fest clap. It's gonna be awesome. It's gonna be awesome in July. I can't even wait. And we live in all of us our own specific places, our own specific worlds. But part of what makes America amazing, and part of what makes, I think through my experience, Louisville amazing, is Hunter S. Thompson's perspective on the world. And for him to be celebrated continually as he is for me very, very important. And so finally, I think I have a note that says context, but we'll just pass through that. And I'm going to read from the book. It's about the 1968 Democratic Convention when Hunter Thompson went out to report on it and was experienced police violence. And then, as I said, I'll read from when he went to the Nixon inauguration in the winter, in a very cold winter of 1969 in January. And so it'll be quick, and then we can talk, and we can all hang out. And I'm so happy to be here with all of you, and it's such a wonderful, wonderful thing. On the evening of Wednesday, August 28th, 1968, day 3 of the Democratic National Convention, Hunter S. Thompson, a 30-year-old journalist working on his second book, was standing on the corner of Michigan and Balboa, a motorcycle helmet stowed in a large blue kit bag at his shoulder. Around him, 7,000 protesters had penned themselves into the four-way intersection, onto which the Lakeview suites of the Sheraton Blackstone and the Conrad Hilton hotels looked down. From across the city, evening was coming on, a late summer twilight, arid and clear, the skyline throwing its great tusks of shadow toward the lake. Thompson had taken up a position against the windows of the Hilton's ground-level restaurant, the Haymarket Inn, where, from behind a row of yellow police barricades, he and other journalists stood alongside a number of Democratic staffers and delegates who'd come down from their rooms with their spouses to see what was going on. Just before 8 p.m., Deputy Superintendent James Rockford, the on-site commander in charge of convention security, received word that additional reinforcements had begun to arrive. along with a contingent of paddy wagons and to transport prisoners. And to the officers gathered around and off of the perimeter, he gave the order, clear the intersection. The Chicago police approached from both ends of Michigan and Balboa in tight military formation. Then they broke into a full run, charging into the crowd, attacking everyone. They swung their billy clubs with overhand strokes in the way you would through lumber, releasing their weapons down onto the heads of their targets. They were wearing sky blue helmets with thick black chin straps. For the most part, they were young men from Irish and Polish and German and Italian families. Before the assault, they'd taken off their badges and nameplates. They knew that the order to attack had been delayed for over a half hour, deliberated upon. And once the word came down through the chain of command, arriving like a small sum of money or an equally modest fine, there could be no doubting that it represented the official position of Chicago's highest civilian authorities. A new round of tear gas volleys shrouded the intersection. In the burning fog, you could hear clubs striking bone, panicked footsteps, and the screams, their orchestral pain. A breeze came up from the lake. It was night. A new wave of cops arrived. Together they chanted, "Kill, kill, kill," an incantation as they approached the intersection. The protesters tried to flee. "Hey," a young man with a mustache said. "God damn." A cop had doubled him over with a club to the gut and was tossing him into one of the paddy wagons. At that moment, a television cameraman was filming these wagons, and now this cop turned and attacked him too. A doctor in a white coat and a Red Cross armband ran to help and was knocked to the ground by pairs of police, who kept beating him as he tried to crawl away. There were plainclothes cops, white-shirted cops. Some had antennas at their backs to relay radio instructions. Others wore long black jackets with chevrons at the shoulders. A few were there on three-wheeled motorcycles, one of whom could be heard as he ran over people, shouting, "Wahoo!" For 15 unbelievable minutes, the Battle of Michigan Avenue raged on. The entire time, Hunter Thompson was standing behind the yellow barricades with his back to the Hilton's ground floor restaurant, watching it all up close. He and the other journalists were still surrounded by older party officials and their wives. From the start, it had been the safest spot. Initially, there'd even been chance of the whole world is watching. But now they were silent. The cops, taking control, prepared for a new assault. On Michigan Avenue, from both the north and the south, two fresh lines of police were advancing. They came together at the Hilton, a classic pincer formation, and the street's remaining protesters, perhaps 500, suddenly had nowhere to go. The cops kept pressing them back in the direction of the hotel, its floor-level restaurant, the exact spot where Thompson was standing. Now the officers charged. They sprayed mace from handheld cans and came in fast behind the wet, fogging bursts. The protesters surged back over the barricade. Thompson was forced against the Hilton. "Stay together," some of them were shouting. A few tried to break through the line in groups, but they were quickly separated and beaten. The cordon was complete. 1,000 people were pinned against the plate glass windows of the Conrad Hilton Hotel. The police gathered and blitzed their final assault. Thompson reached frantically for the motorcycle helmet in his bag. He slipped it on just as the cops got to him. Bodies at his back and feet, and then the overhand blow, the billy club coming down on his motorcycle helmet, a plastic and leather dome that would have amplified into his ears the deafening bang. At the same time, it had protected his skull and brain, which meant that, unlike the other concussed men and women lying around him, he could still register with all his faculties intact the unmistakable message. The civic authorities were using indiscriminate violence to silence their legitimate political opposition and journalistic observers. Thompson knew immediately that if they were willing to do this, if on national television the rights inherent to the Constitution of the United States could be completely and unequivocally discarded, then they could do anything. From behind, he heard a new crash. Now the crowd was being forced through the Haymarket's plate glass window, which loudly shattered. Men and women tumbled helplessly down into the restaurant. The police followed them in, leaping, clubs drawn. Thompson was a few feet away. Around him, the cops shoved past. What was happening to the people who only minutes before were standing next to him? Were they down there now on the ruthless glass-strewn floor of the Haymarket? Suddenly he was sure he was about to be hit by a hail of bullets, fired from above, from a rooftop, the shot exploding in his chest before he'd ever even heard the report. There was nothing he could do. I have never been caught in an earthquake, he'd say about this moment later. But I'm sure the feeling would be just the same, total panic and disbelief, with no escape. Something was coming that he couldn't see, speeding toward him from the menace of the night. At that instant, pinned against the shattered wall of the Haymarket, he was overcome with the terror and paralysis and regret of what it means to be hit and then, as if in a nightmare, go down. It was the sort of fear Bobby Kennedy had been made to feel 2 months earlier, during those waning moments on the Ambassador Hotel's concrete floor, when he could still ask if everyone else was okay, aware that his life was leaving him, but helpless to do anything but watch it go. We're talking about the saddest moment of all, the one in which you finally realize you're beyond everyone else's reach. Inside the Hilton, a protester with a severed neck artery was slumped against the wall. Another, his legs paralyzed, crawled on his elbows. Cops beat them anyways, beating the diners who'd been sitting at the Haymarket too. Then they moved to the lobby. Clear the floor, one of them shouted. By now they didn't care about arresting people. The intersection was secure. Just then Hunter S. Thompson saw an opening. Through the remaining crowd of police and wounded protesters, he sprinted to the Blackstone Hotel, about 60 feet away, where the cops near the entrance clubbed him back. I live here, goddammit, he screamed. I'm paying $50 a day. He was shoved into the door. He pulled out his room key and waved it overhead until finally someone let him pass through into the lobby. In his room, he locked and chained the door. His eyes burned. His clothes stank with chemicals. His gut ached, but he was unharmed. He wet a cloth and held it carefully to his face to soak out the tear gas. Then he sat on the bed, his legs crossed. His entire body was shaking. He couldn't write. None of it made sense. The whole week, the police had known that he was a member of the press, that the men and women they'd forced through the Haymarket window were political officials, that a number of the nonviolent young protesters worked as campaign staffers for Democratic candidates. But then that was the horrific point. Years later, looking back on this moment, he'd write, "These b***ers knew my position, and they wanted to beat me anyway. They were powerful enough to break anybody who even thought about getting in their way. What I learned in Chicago was that the police arm of the United States government was capable of hiring vengeful thugs to break the very rules we all thought we were operating under." The violence he'd witnessed was clearly state-sanctioned, political, and it had originated within the core electoral process of the democratic system it now threatened. In this sense, we, all of us, were its authors and performers and intended audience. All along, the violence had been with us, was us, a song for America we'd been singing from the start. It was just after 9 p.m. Down at the Stockyards Amphitheater, the official balloting for the presidential nomination was about to begin. Thompson still had his press pass. It had been around his neck the entire time, and he planned to use it now for something other than an invitation to a beating. And so this happened in August of 1968, and then Nixon was elected. Because of this, as Pat Buchanan said, quoting Hunter S. Thompson, one of the main reasons that Richard Nixon ever became president was what happened in Chicago. And so I'm just going to read a small, very short portion of when Hunter S. Thompson went to the 1969 inauguration of Richard Nixon. On Monday, January 20th, 1969, beneath a low Atlantic sky the color of wet concrete, Richard Milhouse Nixon descended the steps of the Capitol's east portico and repeated back the oath administered to him by Chief Justice Earl Warren, taking office as the 37th President of the United States. "The greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker," Nixon proclaimed in his address. My Nixon imitation is very terrible, and so we'll do our best to make it through it. "When we listen to the better angels of our nature," Nixon said, quoting Abraham Lincoln, "we find that they celebrate simple things, the basic things such as goodness, decency, love, kindness." Hunter S. Thompson had made the trip from Colorado to cover the inauguration for the Boston Globe's Weekend magazine. "The peace we seek to win is not victory over any other people, but the peace that comes with healing in its wings," Nixon said. "As our eyes catch the dimness of the first rays of dawn, let us not curse the remaining dark. Let us gather the light." Immediately, Thompson recognized the source of the overwrought rhetoric. Ray Price, the administration's chief speechwriter, who'd helped spearhead during the campaign the rebranding effort that had sought to repackage Nixon as the patriotic, stabilizing unifier America so desperately needed. Not that such a feat would have been possible without the specific candidate's mutability. By this point, Thompson had been writing about Richard Nixon for nearly a decade. And from the start, he understood exactly what it was that made this particular politician so dangerous, an innate and sinister talent for deception that the American electorate, when presented over and over again with its unabashed used car salesman tenor, somehow kept mistaking for an entirely different trait, ambition. And now, in victory, Richard Nixon had proved that he could become anything, including against all odds, the unquestioned leader of the free world. For its part, Nixon said to end his address, government will listen. We will strive to listen in new ways. And then he got into his enormous, bulletproof Lincoln limousine and kicked off the day's inaugural parade, which, in its route from the Capitol to the White House, would take him within a literal stone's throw of the thousands of protesters who'd line the streets who'd line the city streets. Hunter Thompson, thanks to his press credentials, was able to stake out a prime spot at the end of the parade route, the corner of Pennsylvania and 15th Street, across from the large stand of bleachers. The intersection where the president's vanguard would make its penultimate turn before passing into the vast security cordon of the White House. It was early afternoon. The wind came down from the northeast, freezing and brittle, knocking at everyone's hats and handbills and high-collared coats. Nixon's motorcade advanced directly into its teeth, up the city's long-angled corridor, Pennsylvania Avenue, a diagonal that connected one seat of American power with the next. The procession was led by a wedge of 30 police motorcycles. Secret Service agents trotted alongside. The protesters had posted up along the parade route at 3 main locations. Throughout the weekend, there'd been a gathering for what was called the Counter-Inaugural, a multi-day event organized by the same activists from the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, including David Dellinger and Jerry Rubin, who together were facing 5-year prison sentences in Illinois on trumped-up conspiracy to riot charges. After Chicago, the general mood of the anti-war movement had soured. Violence and confrontation are the themes now, Thompson would write in his Globe feature. Vicious dissidence is the style. As the motorcade approached the intersection of 12th and Pennsylvania, the site of the old post office, the first small group was waiting. They were flanked front and back by Navy-jacketed DC police and National Guardsmen, as well as an additional unarmed contingent from the Army's 82nd Airborne Division. Not that it mattered. As soon as the limousine appeared, they unleashed a dense hail of rocks and sticks. Members of the Secret Service, walking alongside, struggled to bat down the projectiles. Someone lofted a softball-sized wad of tinfoil that, in its precipitous arc, appeared to be falling directly toward the vehicle carrying Mr. and Mrs. Nixon, which accelerated, jolting its occupants and forcing the agents on the street into an accompanying run. The next set of protesters, the largest, had gathered at 14th Street near the National Theater on the north side of Pennsylvania, the parade route's widest spot. Here, more than 1,000 young men and women chanted slogans at the motorcade. 4 more years of death. Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh. NLF is going to win. 2468, organized to smash the state. And I edited this out because of the swearing, but 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your war. From the crowd came a new barrage, a paint-filled Christmas ornament shattered against the pavement. A smoking can was tossed just ahead of the presidential limousine, rolling underneath. National Guardsmen and DC police surged against the crowd, reaching for the assailants. But the protesters grabbed and beat anyone from law enforcement unlucky enough to venture too far into their midst. One cop, charging into the crowd, had been nearly stripped naked. And as a result, the hill kept coming down. They threw stones, bottles, cans, firecrackers, and smoke bombs. They threw pennies and pebbles. They threw table forks and a spoon. They threw tomatoes. They threw manure. They lit on fire miniature American flags that the Boy Scouts had been passing out and threw them as hard as they could in the general direction of the new president. It was 2:45 p.m. Hunter Thompson was still in the spot at Pennsylvania and 15th Street, across the avenue in the white plank bleachers, where the counter-inaugural leaders had legitimately purchased 200 tickets. Protesters were holding up signs with messages like, "Stop the war against Black America," and "Nixon is the one, the #1 war criminal." They waved Viet Cong banners. They passed around a blotchy dark sack they kept calling the black flag of anarchy. Someone threw a half-gallon jug of wine. Standing alongside Thompson, a newscaster from CBS announced into the microphone, "Here comes the president." From around the corner, the limousine appeared. A sort of huge, hollowed-out cannonball on wheels, Thompson would later write. A very nasty-looking armored car. There was a stench of bedrock finality about it. It had been a year of assassinations and police riots and defeats that had led, for Hunter Thompson, to the most unthinkable outcome of all: Richard Nixon's victory march to the White House lawn. The whole concept of peaceful protest died at the Democratic Convention, Thompson wrote that night for his Boston Globe piece. Up until Chicago, there had been the assumption, however far-fetched, that the politicians running the country were capable of perceiving a mass demonstration on something like the war in Vietnam within the context of America's general political reality, that they were listening, were willing to play by the same set of guidelines that the Republic had agreed upon almost 2 centuries earlier, even if they vehemently disagreed with everything that was going on and that they heard. As Hunter Thompson wrote, the 1960s were full of examples of good, powerful men changing their minds on heavy issues. The pinnacles being Lyndon Johnson and his shocking decision to recognize his failure in Vietnam and preemptively forgo running for a second term, which was why the current reality felt so devastating. As Thompson would say, with Agnew and Mitchell coming into power, he'd explain, there was simply no point in yelling at them. They were born deaf and stupid. He realized that it no longer mattered how effectively you conducted a demonstration. The people you were hoping to reach were incapable of hearing what you had to say. The presidential limousine continued past Thompson. He watched it turn from 15th Street to the White House and then disappear behind a wall of black, leafless trees. The temperature was dropping. The sky thickened and dimmed. Now the protesters were fighting among themselves. Police rode by on horseback. The wind lifted and let fall the parade's long ribbon of debris. Overhead, an enormous helicopter beat the air. The city smelled the way it always does in winter, like dust and freezing rain and shallow, stagnant water. Thompson zipped up his ski jacket and walked south towards the mall. Around him, the white sand statues and memorials revealed themselves as if haphazardly, like relics, the individual meaning of each suddenly subsumed beneath the thing the city had become. Mr. Nixon's city, a monument to the office that Nixon had finally won, to him. From the mall, Thompson could see Arlington National Cemetery, its vast hillside landscaped evenly with more graves than he could count. That was part of the monument, too, the worst part. Across the Gray River, Bobby Kennedy lay closed in a coffin only a few feet off from that of his older brother. Both of them forced now to adorn, in death, in silence, the sinister spectacle of the present. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing, Bobby Kennedy had said just before he was assassinated, a quote his brother had attributed to Edmund Burke. Thompson would never forget hearing this line. He'd hold it dear for the rest of his life. Though on a day as haunted as this one, such wisdom could be heard to mean something different. It's only after the very best of us are driven into silence that the most destructive characteristics in our nature find the means to flourish. And suddenly Hunter Thompson felt disgusted and bone-chilled and at a loss. Overhead, the sky was about to break. He walked back to the hotel in the wind. What a fantastic monument, he'd write, to all the best instincts of the human race this country might have been if we could have kept it out of the hands of greedy little hustlers like Richard Nixon. Thank you. Officer?
Do you think if he was alive today, he would end that sentence with interim?
I hope so. I think it's wonderful to have Juan Thompson, and it's wonderful to have Ron Whitehead to talk to as people that knew him so well and as people that understand his perspective so well. I think that the way all of us are feeling right now about America has been voiced in his writing in the past and would be lovely to be voiced right now. And it's a perspective we miss. I got to stop talking with my hands. I guess that there's microphones on my chest. I don't realize that. I blame my Italian ancestors, but it's fine. But yes, and I think after Tuesday night, where Lauren, who runs, helps out with Gonzo Fest and is so amazing, we were lucky enough to talk about America and about the course that this country is taking. I think it's a perspective that we need more than ever. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, come on, right? Like, for sure.
Tim, you and I got to talk a little bit the other night, and you described when you first conceptualized this book was prior to the election. And then some things changed, and perhaps it became even more relevant to you and maybe changed some of the things you were thinking. Can you talk about that in more detail? That had to be a pretty significant shift.
Thank you, Chandra, for the question. I think Hunter S. Thompson's writing is brilliant all the way through from start to finish. And after 2016, what was happening in America, what we've all of us been dealing with, whether we're on the right or on the left, was a new lens that had, in a sense, been placed over all of his work. But it was all brilliantly articulated by him from start to finish. And it's a gift to us right now to be able to read his reaction to and commentary on the American Republic that, he recorded for all of us. Writing is a way to talk with people that are gone from this world, whether they're Virgil, whether they've been gone for 2,000 years and they're Roman poets, whether they've been gone for 5,000 years, whether they've been gone for 500 years, however long they've been gone, it's their logic that's given to us that we get to interact with. And it's such a gift right now, after events like Tuesday, after events like 2016, to hear this brilliant perspective into what's going on within our country and how relevant it remains. And so after 2016, the book itself changed, but Thompson's writing remained the same. I just hope that I perhaps began to see it from a better perspective. I began to see it from the distance I was looking for, and that helped allow the book to come out. But the most important thing is his voice and his perspective.
It was interesting to me. You started out talking about his work on the Hells Angels. I guess he initially did a piece commissioned by The Nation. It turned into a book, and in the book, and it seems like you draw a yarn of how he started to view the Hells Angels, a kind of a yarn that's drawn to what we experienced in 2016.
There's a great book of interviews that just came out. It was called The Last Interview with Hunter S. Thompson. It's by David Streitfeld from the New York Times, wonderful reporter. And he, for the first time, published interviews from the Chicago NewsHour in which Hunter S. Thompson talks about the Hells Angels. And he talks about how their perspective is inherently fascistic. Like they're inherently based on violence, intimidation, and the fact that they have no tolerance for anybody that deviates from what they see as the main group in America. And to read that again, to read that right now in 2016, and to see in 2018, to see American anger played out in a different manifestation, but in a recognizable manifestation, and to see it played out by the way that Hunter S. Thompson wrote about it, which Hells Angels is a beautiful book. It's a fantastic book, is both terrifying and heartening. We've always been this messed up, but we've always been an unjust. We've always been a nation that struggled and has not been on point with justice and with gender and with power and with all of the different aspects that define this world. And to know that 50 years ago, things were just as terrible is not necessarily heartening, but at least we can move forward to it helps us a little bit.
He kind of deviated because they were getting a lot of coverage at the time and kind of went against how they wanted to be received.
He was, from my experience reading his work and through research, he was so amazing at articulating the way the media was being manipulated by certain powerful groups, whether they were a hip group like the Hells Angels who wanted to get their version of themselves out there, or they were Richard Nixon trying to get themselves out there. And the way that the press, not having familiarity with either, not knowing enough with either, would propagate and continue to disseminate that false view. And with the Hells Angels especially, he was like, oh my God, this Time Magazine article is terrible. Like, it's terrible. Like, it doesn't know anything about what its subject is. And he was, in that sense, so brilliantly specific and on point when it came to knowing what's going on in America. Ron?
I'd like to ask what everybody thinks with the new tactic today for Mr. Trump, where he actually re-rigged a video to accuse Costa of manhandling a woman at the briefing today.
Well, I mean, that's terrifying.
How low can you go?
I love that. I love the way Hunter S. Thompson wrote about truth with a capital T, and he wrote about it being something bigger than assorted facts, than assorted general evidence. And that's a difficult thing to articulate right now, because we believe that if you hold up a clip of Trump saying one thing and then another video clip of Trump saying another thing, that will hold him accountable. But it doesn't. We've learned that what power is the ability to refuse reality and to say it doesn't exist. And what I love about Hunter S. Thompson's writing is that he's been able to articulate in the works that I love the most, that whatever this reality is, there is a bigger moral truth that dominates it and that we need to look at. And he wrote about that with Richard Nixon. He wrote about it with Lyndon Baines Johnson. He wrote about it with Mayor Richard Daley. And that's what matters. He understood the way that the press could be manipulated again by people in power, but he also understood that we can never add up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 truth. And instead, he trusted his instincts about America and about people. And his best writing is still a gift to us right now about where America is and where it should be. Ron?
I would like to say thank you, Timothy. For those of you who have not read Timothy's book, thus far, I've said when asked, where should I start? What book should I read about Hunter? Well, the two best are William McKean's Outlaw Journalist, The Life and Times of Hunter S. Thompson, and Juan F. Thompson's Stories I Tell Myself Growing Up with Hunter S. Thompson. But now you have broken new ground, and not only does your book read in a novelistic action thriller way, and it's because that's the way Hunter lived his life and the way he thought and wrote, but it's the way you presented the research you did and the way you presented what you discovered. And so it's a groundbreaking work that I'm so thrilled about. And I know that other folks are working on, like Rory, Patrick Feehan just got his PhD at the University of Limerick. His dissertation on Hunter is brilliant. So more books are going to be coming out. But you're the first one to focus on the 10 years of Hunter's life when he was coming into his own and discovering who he was as a writer and a person, finding his voice, which led to a new form of writing, not just journalism, but writing. Hunter pulled the rug out from the scientific method, like quantum physics did in science. He showed that the fallacy of objectivity. He placed himself in the story. He said, you can't tell the truth unless you're there in the story. And so that changed the game for everybody. And it freed everybody up, right, left, wherever. Let's tell the truth, people who have the courage. So anyway, I want to say thank you so much for the work you've done with this brilliant new book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for making wonderful art, and as you bring up Juan's beautiful book, and as you bring up Bill McKean's beautiful book, and Rory Freehand's amazing thesis. Thank you for articulating right now that this perspective, this person who pulled the rug out from us, he made amazing art. And you know, as an artist, someone who's spent your life devoted to art, how hard that is. And I'm very thankful for your perspective on that, more than I can say.
I can see a growing trend of writers experimenting with all types of drugs, especially with psychedelics, and trying to create their own voice. And in a way, it seems almost obvious, but I'm wondering, did Hunter ever write in personal correspondence or in a diary in which what he did to basically find his voice and what drugs he used for that?
You know, that's a good question. I think that he, as a side note, in writing letters to friends and being in that relaxed space of writing letters instead of in the more difficult space of writing journalism, I think that his relaxed voice in the early 1960s comes through later in his work that he creates. And in letters to friends where he had finished his writing that whole night, and he kind of unwound, or he wound up or unwound by writing to a friend. He would say, you know, good to see you, like blah, blah, blah. And it was so loose and engaging and elastic. And much of the voice that I think we see later in his great work comes out in those very early letters. And Doug Brinkley did a wonderful job in choosing those. I know how many. He had like 15. For one, every letter he chose, 15 were left out. But to answer your question, I'll answer it two ways. One, I'd say drugs, I'm all for them, but they're not a path toward wisdom. That's only gained by crossing through time and experience your present to the future and learning. And secondly, I mean, he did write about, at certain times, what it was like to take mescaline for the first time, and he kind of live blogged it with his typewriter in Los Angeles, and just went through a moment by moment where he's writing in the instant present. And I think that you can see the world more beautifully through those experiences. He, as a writer, was so amazing at looking at the past self versus the present self who's creating something on the page. And that's not a space we necessarily have when it comes to live blogging or journaling your reaction to something. So while his letters, which are instant, you know, his letters are the moment of telling, while those are amazing, I think he's so incredible at dramatizing bewilderment of the past self, dramatizing how he was confused of the past self. And it was because he was at the middle of the National Republican Convention, which is insane. And anybody would be confused at it. And we should be confused at it. It was a terrible space. And he dramatizes that so fantastically. And that's, you know, something I've never forgotten. It's something I like to think I saw the first time I had a chance to read him, which was amazing.
Thank you for your writing and your sharing of your writing. What really resonated with me as you were reading that was how this was such a clash of ideas, and that even though the people, you know, some of these people are dead and gone, and I'm sure if we went back farther in history, we would find these same ideas clashing, you know, crashing up against each other. And of course, it takes people to bring them alive in that struggle. And so that's what really resonated with me, how those ideas were just, you know, smashing into each other. And when you talked when you read about how he was saying how the demonstrators were even fighting among themselves, and as having lived through that period of time, that was so true. The struggles that went on within the struggle, and the struggles that went on within all the movements, and how we see that even now so clearly going on, whether it's the continuum is the left or the right. Those ideas, all those ideas were present and have been present for so long, and maybe they morph into, you know, crystallized in different ways, but, you know, and then people take them on and act them out. And that's, I just wanted to share that I had that experience of feeling that with what you were reading, and thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for saying that. I think it's hard for someone like me, who was born in 1979, to realize how terrible 1968 was in every way. To have, you start the year with LBJ abdicating, basically, where he said, I'm listening to the anti-war movement, I'm not going to run again for president. And then you have Martin Luther King Jr. through political violence murdered. You have Bobby Kennedy murdered on the floor of the Ambassador Hotel. You have delegates and operatives within the Democratic Party beaten to silence them, along with the press, who were beaten too. And then you have Richard Nixon win. And I didn't live through it. You know, I wrote this mostly after 2016. And I tried to take that emotion of the present, which is horrific. What we're experiencing now is horrific. There's no way to explain it. It's terrible. It's going to get worse. And if our only solace is that, 1968 was also terrible. I mean, that reminds me of Bobby Kennedy's line on his memorial, which is, "Wisdom through the awful grace of God comes drip by drip into the heart." It's a quote by Aeschylus, and it's about how even when you gain knowledge, that's always inseparable. That's always, even when you gain knowledge, it's always linked to pain. And that's the movement forward, and it's just terrifying. I'm sure things will work out okay. Maybe. Probably not. You know, if we made it 50 years to now, we'll make it for you. Thank you.
Hi, I'd just like to thank you for doing this, and I didn't live through it either. I was born in 1967. The promotional materials for this talk indicated that you wanted to talk about a sacrifice that Hunter S. Thompson made for his art and for getting his message out. Can you say more about that?
I think one thing that I learned in research and in interviews, and this is an excellent question, thank you. One thing that I learned in research and interviews is the enormous amount of effort that Hunter S. Thompson put out for his art. And it was effort that was research-based, it was effort that was narrative-based, and most of all, it was effort that was related to being at these key moments in American history as they were unfolding through his freelance journalist experience. And that came at a price. Like, there's not a lot of money in freelance journalism. Then or now. There's not a lot now. There wasn't a lot then. It was still very difficult. And he did it. Like, he persevered. He could have sold out very easily. And of course he didn't. But I think we forget how tempting that offer might be, to just sell out and work for Time Inc. and write terrible, like 800-word sidebars, instead of writing about the American experience and instead of making art. And he chose to make art and to continue to follow that. And to me, that's such a fantastic example of perhaps the direction we might go right now when we're facing a similar difficult time.
We probably have, I was going to say we probably have time for one more question or comment.
He made $100 for that First Nation piece. What would that be equivalent to today?
So it's great. There's the two best sites for research. These are secret tips that I only tell my graduate students. One is historical weather, where you can go back and find what the weather was like on that certain day, and they have it in certain cities. And the other is currency converter. And so they'll convert it. And so that was probably about $800, $900, $1,000. And that was about rent in San Francisco before San Francisco is now San Francisco, where rent in San Francisco was $1,000 instead of $5,000, whatever it is right now, which is absolutely absurd. But it was his rent. It was $100 in a city that had not become a fortress the way that it is now, and that was an enormous amount of money. And it's hard for us, I think, to understand it, and what he experienced. Getting that article from Terry McWilliams, who was the editor at The Nation and who believed in his work and who was excited about it as Thompson was excited about it.
Was there another hand a moment ago? No? Okay. All right. So this will be our last question or comment.
For a lot of people, Hunter Thompson's synonymous with Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and a lot of people have misinterpreted it. What do you think the real theme of that novel was?
Power. I mean, it's about exploited. Thank you for the question. It's about exploited American power. It's about Americans being exploited by the people who ask the least questions about their role in the society, whether they're district attorneys, whether they're the people that are gambling on a dawn morning in Las Vegas, whoever they are. It's about people that never question why they had this incredible privilege and power within American society. And he looked at them and he said, God damn it, in my opinion, he said, you can sit here and have all the vices that you then, when you see another vice like marijuana or another vice like drinking, say is wrong. And he was outraged. And he was, in my opinion, right to be outraged. I think Las Vegas is the version of America. When we're a fascistic like boat that sailed away, we will be on. You know, that's where we'll end up. Like, that's a terrible, meretricious, and unjust space. And he, in 1971, sensed it. And he was out there with Oscar Zeta Acosta, who's such a brilliant writer and thinker. And The Rise and Fall of the Brown Buffalo, a brilliant film. If you all have a chance to watch it on PBS, it's on PBS on iTunes. It's fantastic, and it's about Oscar Zeta Acosta's development as a activist and as a lawyer. And I think that deeply affected, from what I've seen, Hunter Thompson's point of view. And those two went together, and they looked around and they saw a giant town filled with district attorneys that all looked like George Wallace. And they were like, what the f-? And it was really deeply unjust. And they knew it. And I hope that's what we remember from that book, instead of, you know, whatever we remember from it. We remember the music of the prose. We remember so much of it. We remember the energy at the beginning. We remember what we remember. We can't choose what we remember. But I think it's important to look at what they were both seeing there and how unjust it was.